LPI Takes On Overwhelm. Elaine Teo, Paul Genovese, Living Potential International. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, LPI Takes On. I'm Elaine Teo, founder and managing partner of LPI Living Potential International.
And I'm Paul Genovese, partner at LPI. We're so happy that you're joining us to talk about real issues we're all facing. This series of podcasts is called LPI Takes On, where we're taking on current topics close to the hearts of many people right now.
And we're also sharing our takes on these topics by sharing some tips and strategies drawn from our own personal experiences facing the same situations, coaching our clients, supporting our family and friends through these pressures as well. We draw from our LPI toolkit, which includes psychology, mindfulness and meditation, leadership coaching and consulting, our own combined 5 decades of corporate and business owner experience, and other areas of expertise, including cross-cultural, work-life balance, diversity and inclusion, and parenthood.
So for today's episode, we decided we want to talk about overwhelm, because overwhelm is something I think all of us can relate to right now. And when we thought about what people are facing right now, we came up with the following list. 1, uncertainty. We cope with uncertainty by being able to plan. And when we can't plan, it's easier to feel overwhelmed. Planning is the way we cope with facing an uncertain future. Now with COVID and its unpredictable trajectory and all the disruptions, we've lost a large measure of that control. 2, and very timely, it is the holiday season. And the holiday season is usually a time for family and friends to gather together. It's also usually an overwhelming time in and of itself because of all the stuff to do, people to remember, things to buy, to cook and to plan, all of the emotional expectations and the pressure to feel happy and to celebrate. And all of these things are disrupted this year, which leads to further overwhelm and a sense of limbo, disorientation, isolation, homesickness, and even grief. 3, health itself. Now, health is a baseline for all of us to feel good about our lives. The unseen threat and the potential fatality and long-term consequences of COVID is a great source of worry for many of us, especially those with ones that are, or loved ones that are in high-risk groups, key workers, older people, those with pre-existing conditions, and so forth. And 4, lockdown conditions. Everybody's at home right now. Many places, they're at home again. We're in tight spaces. We've got background noises and disruptions. We're not used to spending all of our time and cooped up with in space, and tempers can fray. Finding that balance can be really difficult and stressful. We don't have any privacy. 5, social isolation. We're used to having our tribe of close friends and family around us that we can share our worries with. We feel accompanied by them, and we get practical support from them, for example, with childcare. And not having easy access to this network we depend on can leave us feeling more overwhelmed at having to cope with a lot more of this all by ourselves. We lose perspective, and many of us tend to magnify our challenges. And 6, young people are especially affected with the ongoing and unpredictable disruptions in education and the examination systems. Also, the economic situation is quite tough on them right now and makes it harder than ever for many young people to secure jobs. Combined with that, multiple rejections are hard on anybody's self-esteem, and there can be a feeling of desperation and when is this going to end?
If you are listening to this thinking, yep, that's me, we want you to know one thing. You're not alone. The problem about the restrictions in meeting and being with other people is that we're all living, it can very easily feel like you're going through this overwhelming situation alone. And that aloneness and isolation can really compound that sense of overwhelm. So the first thing we want to reassure you is you are not alone. You're not. The thousands, millions of people around the world right now, like us, who are also struggling, to make things happen just like you. It's okay to feel like it's all getting to you. By the end of this podcast, we want you to understand that there is good reason to cheer up and feel comforted, because actually you do have more control than you realize. So in this podcast, we'll take a deep dive into understanding what overwhelm actually is and where it stems from in terms of how the mind operates. And this alone will help you to regain a sense of control because you'll be more aware of the pushes and pulls inside you, the mind's tendency towards negativity. So the next time you find yourself starting to slide into a negative perspective about yourself or about how things are going for you, you can call time on that, press reset on your system by taking a few deep, calming in-breaths and out-breaths, for example, and take a simple few steps, which we'll outline for you here in this segment and in subsequent segments as well, to break down your overwhelm and to start to tackle it more effectively.
Yeah. And, I found it really empowering to understand more about the way our minds work, because that allows us to start bypassing our long ingrained bad habits and how we manage ourselves and to cultivate better, healthier ones. Plus, being more mindfully aware of what's going on inside us also helps us start keeping better track of how we are improving as well. And that's a really important step going forward, because when we feel more confident and motivated about facing our issues, then it's a no-brainer that we are, in fact, going to be more competent, creative, and resilient in going about that, compared to if we were just feeling down in the dumps about ourselves, lacking energy, will, or inspiration. So let's get started.
Let's start by taking a closer look at what overwhelm actually is. Now, it's a no-brainer that everyone's different. I mean, we all have a different set of challenges facing each of us. We're also different people with different preferences and backgrounds and cultures and circumstances. So in a way, of course, what it feels like to be overwhelmed will differ from person to person. That much is obvious, right? But if we boil down, most people's experiences of overwhelm, what we find is that there's generally a unifying sense of losing control, of there being maybe too many or too complex, things that one is facing. And for most people, this feeling has been building for some time, and one has been feeling less and less on top of things and increasingly unable to cope with it all. For other people, it could be a very different scenario, though. Like for myself, I've experienced fairly recently, you get a bolt out of the blue. Like when something changes, for example, your child needs to self-isolate, because someone in the school's tested positive. And this bolt out of the blue can land like a spanner, or as the Americans call it, a wrench, a wrench in the works, which disrupts, the rest of your delicately held together arrangements and forcing you to have to readjust. And that can feel absolutely overwhelming. Like one doesn't even know where to start.
Have you ever felt like life comes at you like you're on the receiving end of a tennis ball launcher? I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a machine designed to fire tennis balls at varying rates at a player across the other side of the net to help hone their game, to simulate another player there. And anyway, it can be fun or a little bit stressful. So some days you can keep up just fine, and you swat back ball after ball, no problem, in the zone. But other days, they seem like they're just coming at you too fast. And you hit one and the next one, and you feel like I'm just not going to keep up. And you just hit that one, and you feel like you can just barely make it. There's this sense of, oh no, and it grips you. You're slowly losing control. And you're going to miss that next ball. You just can't keep up. Does that sound at all familiar to you?
Yeah, sadly, all too familiar. I mean, I have no gift for tennis, so to that extent, I don't remember actually having faced one of these myself. I do remember though watching like a candid camera clip years ago where they rigged the ball launcher and as a bit of a prank, and the poor hapless person just stands there, and all of a sudden this tennis ball launcher just starts spitting out balls super fast suddenly, and they're just standing there getting bombarded by all these balls, and it is not a fun feeling. It is not a fun feeling. I mean, when I think about what sort of that sensation feels like, the thing that does come to my mind is Tetris. I mean, I don't know if you remember Tetris, Paul, but I definitely remember Tetris because I loved it. I mean, I was in high school or secondary school then, and those are the days. I remember I'll come back, dump my school bag, on the ground, rush over to my desktop, stick in the floppy disk. You remember those, the big ones, not even the little ones, talking the big ones. And the familiar sort of dun, da, 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 music comes on, and then your heart will be racing because you're just kind of all primed to go get it. And I mean, I will play for hours, Paul. I mean, seriously, I'll play until tears will be streaming down from my eyes. It's not something I would advocate to anybody, really. But the adrenaline, I mean, the adrenaline is almost sick of pleasure of like being pushed to breaking point where all these bricks will be falling down faster and faster, and you start stacking them all up. But that is the image that comes to my mind when I think about overwhelm. Um, you know, there is fun in there, right? I mean, otherwise it wouldn't come out of a game like Tetris. But the problem is that when we think about how this translates into our real life, you learn the hard way that that kind of adrenaline kick of trying to outsmart this falling bricks falling faster and faster into you, this nervous sort of high, that's never sustainable. This is not a way to live long term. And I mean in the beginning, and I know I've had friends and colleagues, in various, industries, etc., where you almost get by with that kind of backdrop being your way of life, as it were. But you just see people burn out, one by one, and that's just never sustainable, really, in a healthy way for any of us human beings in the long term. We get burnt out. Our well-being suffers, our relationships suffer, and we'll invariably end up feeling perilously close to being a failure, if not an outright failure. And unfortunately, still, in real life as well as in Tetris, the blocks still keep on falling. It is not a happy place to be. And when we think about how we translate that analogy into how we cope with our day-to-day overwhelm in these situations that you described earlier on, we need to learn to be strategic about the blocks we choose to handle and the blocks we choose to slot into our lives. Real life is not like Tetris. We can choose which are the blocks that we want to pick up and which are the ones that we just want to let go of so that we can focus on the really important pieces in our life. We don't really have a choice, especially in circumstances as dire as what we're facing right now.
Yeah. Tetris and floppy disks. Things I remember
Those
well.
are the days, right?
And real life is not Tetris, but it can feel that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned a real keystone to managing overwhelm. And what I think I heard you talk about was focus. What I learned growing up playing goalie at ice hockey is that the way I managed my thoughts and emotions was every bit, if not more important, than my physical conditioning or my athletic ability. And as you might imagine, I don't imagine you ever played goalie in ice hockey, but growing up in Singapore.
Barely learned to ice skate. I was about it. In very bad form as well.
Right. But still, I'll trust that you can imagine that a goalie faces tremendous pressure as literally that last line of defense. One mistake and the puck's behind you in the net, and you've let your team down and you've let the fans down. And that can weigh on you. The pressure can easily be overwhelming. So what separates a good night in net versus a bad night? It wasn't so much the talent of the team I faced or how well or poorly my team did in front of me. It was more about how well I managed to tamp down the sense of overwhelming by keeping control of my own thoughts and my own emotions. The essence of that is focus. I had to learn that a goal scored on me was just a goal. It wasn't the game. I didn't need to load it down with a whole bunch of feelings of shame and failure and spin a negative yarn about how it would bruise the rest of my life, how my teammates might blame me for a loss, and I'd be less popular in school, my girlfriend would dump me, and so on. And those ruminations distracted my attention by putting extra pressure on myself. And sure enough, I let in another goal that I should have stopped, and then another, and then another. Negative attention and focus became a self-fulfilling prophecy for me. And I had to learn to cope with that. A goal was just a goal. And over time, I learned instead just to scoop the puck out of the net, take a deep breath to steady myself, refocus, and play on.
So now that we have a clearer idea of what we're talking about when we refer to overwhelm, let's start by unpacking some facts about the mind and how it works that help you to understand why our minds and our feelings tend to slide towards feeling overwhelmed. When we understand these facts about the mind, we can kind of see it coming better and be better prepared, increasingly as we practice to diffuse and to redirect ourselves towards more helpful feelings, thoughts, and actions the next time we notice we're starting to get overwhelmed again.
Now, Here's the first thing I want you to know about the mind. We tend to catastrophize. You probably already knew that. But it's okay. It's an unconscious bias. In 2001, psychologists Paul Rosen and Edward Roisman first identified the negativity bias as they framed it. And the negativity bias means that our minds seem to be hardwired to automatically pay more attention to negative things more so than positive things. This is a well-documented phenomenon, and we can easily notice this happening within ourselves. I'm sure you will agree. Let me just give you an example how this might play out in our lives. And I want you to just see if this sounds at all familiar to you. So last Christmas, I made a special gift for an old friend of mine. It was a metal sculpture that he hinted that he'd love to have. And I spent some time designing and fabricating it. It was a labor of love. And I just couldn't wait to rush it to him so that he'd have it by Christmas Day. And I anxiously got online with UPS and tracked the package to see that it would arrive in time for him to open it on Christmas Eve. And I saw that it did arrive. And I was just so excited to see his reaction when he opened it. I figured, well, he'd just stop whatever he was doing. He would just call or text me immediately. But I didn't hear from him that day. And I thought, oh, well, I'm sure he's just busy with, his family at home and the kids and so forth. And I'd probably hear from him the next day, but I didn't. And a week went by and then nothing. So I thought perhaps he was spending the holidays at his cabin and was off the grid or something like that. And then a few more weeks went by without hearing anything. And I started to feel a little bit hurt that all the thought and effort I put into that special gift to him somehow went ignored. And this was totally out of character for him. And I began to conclude that I'd done something horribly wrong and deeply offending him in some way. I was devastated. But then I began to worry about his health or perhaps, some tragedy that happened to him or his family. And I reassured myself that there must be some good explanation. But all I could come up with were bad explanations. All of these bad stories that I told myself. Do those stories sound familiar? First of all, obviously, they were just that, stories that I told myself. Second, they're all stories where I filled the void of uncertainty with negative outcomes. Why didn't I just tell myself positive stories like, well, maybe he found out that he was a grandpa and he was just too happily distracted with the good news. Or maybe he and his wife had taken that long anticipated trip to Italy that they've been planning for some time. So this negativity bias is a natural tendency that most of us have. Oh, and just in case you're wondering what the real story was, he called me a few weeks into the new year, absolutely thrilled to receive his gift. And what happened is actually kind of a funny story. I had shipped his gift in a box that I had handy, which was just one I had laying around that had some old snowblower parts in it. And his wife understandably thought the box was just snowblower parts and put it out in the shed where he eventually stumbled upon it. So the problem is that this is such an ingrained habit or pattern of behavior for most of us that easily compounds our sense of feeling overwhelmed. And it leads us to ignore potential positive alternative interpretations to the same event. And it then kicks in this vicious cycle. The more fearful and tense we are, the less we're able to stay positive, calm, not to freak out, not to see the worst in everything. But when we know this, when we know that our minds have this unconscious bias, we can pay better attention to ourselves when we start to feel or think that way, and we can catch ourselves doing it and redirect ourselves away towards consciously being less negative and more positive instead. And this leads us straight into the second quirk of how our minds work. Namely, our minds like to create a chain of events. Our storytelling minds have this nasty tendency to run away with themselves. We start from one small, isolated, actually completely manageable point in itself, and we end up creating this whole chain of events in our minds. And the problem is, this is such a common practice that we don't see that it's us who is letting our minds run wild. Our projections and conjectures and all our fears. And yet, like we heard in my story about my gift, which got misplaced, do these chain of events really happen this way? So often, most often, I'd wager they don't. Mm-hmm. And yet, instead of noticing that this chain of events doesn't actually work out like that, and therefore the next time we should notice and stop ourselves from going down that rabbit hole, we just fall into the same trap again. This quirk of our minds contributes a lot to our feeling overwhelmed, doesn't it? Because if you reflect carefully on the things that are contributing to your sense of overwhelm right now, whether it's your work, your family, your friends, your health, your financial situation, your relationships, or other personal issues, you may just find that quite a lot of this tension, anxiety, worry, fear, or panic in your sense of overwhelm actually comes from imaginary scenarios and outcomes that you spun out real quick. I mean, but they feel emotionally real to you, don't they? But they're not real. They're just ideas. But it feels real to us being in it. But if you actually step out of it, for example, when you're practicing mindfulness, you'll see it's just your own interpretation and joinings up of things that don't necessarily join. So here's another example of how this chain of events can easily spin off from one small trigger. Just imagine you're in an online meeting right now and your internet just went on the blink, just like it did when we were recording this podcast.
Very real example. Sadly.
Yes. So, and you may have experienced this, and these are the thoughts that might run through your head in that situation. Oh my God, I can't believe my internet just went down just when I need to score that point. And now the client thinks I'm unprofessional and we can't get it together. And I've embarrassed my teammates and there's only 12 more minutes left and I have to reconnect before the end of the meeting because I really want to land that point again and now I'm not going to be able to. And that's going to damage our case. Our manager's going to be really upset with me and the team and it's all going to be my fault. And we're going to lose the client's interest. And I know that our competitors have been pitching them too and they're probably going to win it now. And it's going to damage my promotion prospects during the January appraisal. And we really needed that salary increase because we're not going to be able to afford that bathroom renovation that we otherwise need. And stop.
Getting stressed listening to that.
Stop. Breathe. Recognize that this negativity bias is a real danger. Recognize that our storytelling minds will tend to run away with themselves, creating all kinds of scenarios unless we hack that loop and we break that chain. Recognize that we're winding ourselves up this way and that what feels so real to us is often really not going to happen at all. So we have a choice. We can either go on feeding ourselves negativity and catastrophic doomsday scenarios and end up freaking ourselves out. The tragedy is that most of the time, this is entirely avoidable because we're the ones that are creating these scenarios, and therefore, we're also the ones who are effectively generating extra stress and suffering for ourselves. But if that's the case, then there's a flip side to it. We're therefore also the ones that have the power to stop torturing ourselves by sliding into catastrophizing and fabricating a whole negative chain of events from a single isolated trigger point. We are the ones who can notice ourselves going down this negative spiral and redirect our minds and hearts to a more wholesome direction. Okay? How do we do that, Elaine?
The good news, Paul, is yes, it is possible. It is possible to unshackle ourselves from these bad habits of catastrophizing and creating a chain of events in our minds. It is possible for every single one of us to retrain ourselves so that we attune our attention and our energy away from these detrimental behaviors and towards more wholesome mental and emotional patterns instead. In order to do that, though, we need to understand how the mind really works. So, I'm a trained meditation teacher as well as an Oxford educated psychologist. And out of my last 20 plus years, already studying and experiencing the mind, both from third person perspective as well as from first person perspective, there have been quite a few things that I've learned, along the way about how our minds and how, in fact, our consciousnesses work. And one of the most mind-blowing of those things that I've learned about how our minds work is our minds, or rather our sense of consciousness or our sense of awareness itself, our very sense of being aware of things. That is like an inner theater going on inside us where the actors that are coming and going on this stage in this theater of the mind are our thoughts, feelings, sensations, impulses, moods, etc., or what my Buddhist meditation teacher, Dr. Alan Wallace, talks about, our mental phenomena. Here's the thing though. Have you ever really stopped to pay attention to what's actually going on in this, what we call monkey mind? monkey mind because it's chaotic and it's running around. It's a very common Buddhist term, but I'm sure that's something that all of us,
Nice.
right. I mean, have you ever stopped to really pay attention to what's going on in your own mind? Like, watch it the way you almost watch telly, watch it the way you will watch fish swimming around, in a fish tank. Sometimes when we teach mindfulness or meditation, I like to refer to this fish tank of the mind. Here, let's try it for a minute here, okay? So, just close your eyes for a moment and let your attention go inward. Just watch your own mind quietly for a moment. Imagine this mind is a fish tank. And you're watching your fish swimming around in there, which are your thoughts. Can you spot the thought right now, maybe slipping past like a little silverfish? Maybe something like, I mustn't forget to write the email to Mark. There's still those last 3 slides on the client deck to finish. Oh my God, I'm really tired. I wonder what Mum decided to get Jack for Christmas after all. And so on. Take this little moment of peace right now just to try this out and watch the fish swimming in your mind. There are other fish swimming in your mind too. Their feelings. Oh my God, that was a rubbish day today. When is this ever going to end? I'm so worried about everything. You might be feeling a sense of dread at a looming deadline. Excitement or nervousness, anticipating a big meeting ahead. Sadness, missing your family and friends. Nostalgia, regret about this time of the year. Sorrow, bringing back so many memories. Disappointment that this Christmas period is going to be so different. Concern about COVID spreading and your health and so on. When we watch our minds, the fish tanks of our minds like these, it's important to remember we don't have to do anything with any of these thoughts or emotions. We don't have to respond to any of them. Just watch them serenely, like you would peacefully watch the fish in a fish tank, just swirling around, moving around in your mind. Now, let's try and generate one thought and see what happens to it. Bring into your mind a thought. I am thinking this thought right now. I am thinking this thought right now. Got it? Did you notice how you just brought that thought into being just like that? Now try and hold on to that thought. I am thinking this thought right now. Hold it steady in your mind and watch what happens. Do you find that your hold is starting to waver a little? Do you find other thoughts starting to intrude? Maybe your attention's flitting to something else? Is it a strain to try and hold on to the focus? Now open your eyes. How did you find that, Paul?
Wow, that's actually really powerful. It felt like a whole lot of empty space in here with some little fish flitting in and out of the light, and trying to hold on to a thought is like trying to hold on to a fish, it felt like. So
You're lucky to have lots of empty space in there. I'll swap you.
I'm not so sure
I've
about
had one
that,
of those
but
days. The opposite of
a
empty space.
head full of fish. But yeah, I mean, we're so conditioned to be swimming with all of these fish in our heads. It's kind of like a feeding frenzy of the mind up there, and it's consumed all of our attention. But from what you've just taught us, when we step outside of the tank, we can just watch those fish and not have to do. And that's super useful.
What we've just done is a super quick and simple mindfulness exercise. Mindfulness is a type of meditation practice that is just that. It trains your attention to be fully mindful of what is going on in your mind at the present moment. Eventually, mindfulness trains up your ability to direct your attention itself, and that ability to direct your attention to your focus object of your desire, that is an absolute superpower to have. But we'll talk more about that in another podcast. For now, the important point to note here is we've just had a little taste of how our awareness is like a fish tank with lots of fish swirling around in it. And these fish are our individual thoughts, emotions, sensations, impulses, moods, etc. What's important to note is we can choose whether we want to be living in the fish tank amongst all these thoughts and emotions swirling around us, or whether we want to be watching the fish tank. In other words, to be stepping outside the drama and volatility of the events in the fish tank and to be watching them from the outside. And we can all do this. It took me many years to learn that we are not our thoughts. We are not our emotions. Our mind isn't just, composed only of all these so-called permanent components like ideas or beliefs or cultural norms, etc., etc. No. Our mind consists of a fundamental or base awareness. So if we could return to the analogy for a moment, i.e. the theater of the mind, imagine this base awareness is the stage on which all our thoughts, emotions, impulses, moods, and fears, etc., are merely actors. They come, they go, do their thing, and then they go. And that's what our mental phenomena actually do. If you don't believe me, try it. You find that when you start to watch the fish tank of your mind and see how your thoughts and your emotions arise and dissipate naturally, leading one to the next, often very quickly without you noticing it, you will notice two very important things when you start to learn how to watch your mind like that. And they are, firstly, no matter how strong or lingering the momentary thought or feeling can be, it will, believe it or not, but it will naturally fade away by itself if you don't hold on to it. If it doesn't become encoded into a memory, or you are sort of bringing up the memory again and sort of reinfusing yourself, reliving, re-evoking those thoughts and those feelings, if you don't hold on to that original impulse when it enters your mind, it will naturally dissipate. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, most of the time, when that momentary thought or feeling doesn't go away, it's usually because we are holding on to it.
Give me an example of how that might work.
Okay. Imagine, let's see. Imagine you were walking down the road, okay? Imagine you're walking down the road and you were about to step off the curb without really paying attention. Maybe you were on your phone, maybe you were distracted, maybe you were looking at where you're about to go, right? It happens. So you're walking and you're about to sort of cross the road, you step off the curb. And then just as your foot lands on the road, suddenly you hear this ring, and then somebody's yelling at you. And the next second, a bicycle just goes right past you, literally close enough to almost brush you, and you get a bit of a shock. I mean, it being a close call, if that happened to you, Paul, how would you feel?
Yeah, I think at first shocked, maybe a little shaken, maybe a bit angry at myself for, not paying attention. I mean, it could have been a bus, not a bike, right?
Yeah.
I should have been more careful. And, I think a little bit angry maybe at the bicyclist who could have slowed down to avoid me. But then again, it really wasn't his fault because I really didn't look before I walked. And maybe I'm a bit embarrassed and also relieved that I didn't get into an accident or worse, hurt the cyclist, by stepping out in front of him. So yeah, in that moment anyway, lots of pretty strong feelings.
Right. I mean, I think your reaction is pretty common, to most of us being in a situation. Now, imagine this happened on a typical workday, and that you're in your office building half an hour later after this incident, and you're smack bang in the middle of this big meeting. How do you feel now, being in a meeting? More specifically, are you still feeling the same level, the same quality or intensity of shock as you were feeling so primarily, when you were there on the curb, even just half an hour ago? And if not, what do you think would have happened to your feelings by then?
Oh, I think it would have worn off completely. I mean, I probably wouldn't even be thinking about it. That sharp feeling of adrenaline coursing through our bodies. You can't hang on to that. That'd be exhausting.
Yeah. So here's a very interesting thing, isn't it? Probably later on when we're having dinner with our family and we were reliving the incident, we will probably evoke some of that fresh emotion of that shock and that sharpness again. But isn't it interesting that whole hours can pass when that moment, which felt so indelible at the moment when it happened, how quickly something like that, even something as vivid and as unforgettable as that, maybe even as traumatic as that, that it gets overtaken by other thoughts, other feelings, other things that's happening in this fish tank of our mind. So here's a very important thing to understand about the way our minds work. And within here lies, I think, a very big part of the key of starting to free yourself from your cycle of overwhelm. Our thoughts and emotions naturally dissipate by themselves if we don't hold on to them. So when we're feeling overwhelmed, it may feel like that feeling of being swamped, standing in front of the tennis ball launcher, just this feeling of panic, of like things being out of control. It may feel really permanent at that moment. It may feel like that feeling may never go away. So it's absolutely critically important to learn that actually, with that feeling of overwhelm, with the majority of our feelings and thoughts at any given one point in the day, there's so much that we ourselves put into holding on onto our negative emotions or difficulties, maybe even our traumas, our memories, etc. Especially when, as we've learned from what you said, Paul, just now, our minds are not necessarily our best friends here, are they? Because we've learned they have an inbuilt tendency to catastrophize and an inbuilt tendency to create chains of events. So there is a natural slide towards that spectrum already. So what we want to do here, really, with these simple examples, like stepping off the curb and what happens half an hour, later, is to start you on a journey of getting acquainted with yourself, your inner world, and doing that with more care, more mindfulness, attending to what's going on inside the fish tanks or the theaters of your own minds as an ongoing practice. Because actually our minds are also built with many natural advantages that we can make use of and harness much more powerfully to help us unhook ourselves from our catastrophizing and our chain of events, bad habits. And using these natural advantages as well to cope better with strong emotions like panic or fear that might be brought on by the feeling of overwhelm. There is a healthy way to experience these strong thoughts and emotions. We're not advocating that you should suppress them or deny them or minimize them, because that can well end up eating away at you inside like cancer. And a healthy way, therefore, to experience these thoughts and emotions, whether they're strong or whether they're subtle, is to permit ourselves to experience them safely. Like standing in a rainstorm that's just passing by, letting the rainstorm pass right through us, literally pass right through our consciousness, and then naturally dissipate, as the mind is wont to do. After the storm is past, the air naturally returns to clarity, tranquility, and its natural balance. Of course, this takes practice, but that is the path and it is doable. The thing not to do is to make the extremely common mistake of holding on to these traumatic or difficult emotions and thoughts. And we do this in a multiple in a number of ways. We're really good at it as human beings because, either we're doing it in conversation, like for example, if I bump into you in the office corridor, Paul, and you'd be like, what happened, Elaine, or I'll be asking you, Paul, what happened to you? You look as white as a sheet. And you'd be like, oh my God, Elaine, you won't believe what just happened to me. And, before we know it, we're just reliving it again. And, so I think that's the key thing. There's so much about the way we live, that does that, holding on to these traumatic or difficult thoughts and emotions. And this act of mindfulness, this practice of mindfulness allows us to be more aware of how common it is and how often we do it so that we can start stopping ourselves from going there. Because there's an old Native American tale, apocryphal, but some say it's Native American, some say it's another wisdom tradition, but I'll stick with the Native American because, in this particular story, the elder is telling the young one about the two wolves that live in our souls, the good wolf and the bad wolf. And the young one asks, well, with these two wolves always fighting, which one wins in the end? And the answer is always the one you feed. So it's time to stop feeding your sense of overwhelm and to start feeding your sense of control, calmness, stability, equanimity, and unruffledness instead. Now, the question is, how do you even start?
So many great analogies there about all these transient feelings and thoughts, this property that they come and they go. It's really, really quite amazing. And I always think of the weather, it may be a storm out right now, but the sun's going to shine again. But to your point, we've created an LPI 4-step process for tackling overwhelm. And we're going to walk you through those 4 steps right now. The 4 steps are: 1, stem the tide by coming to stillness. 2, digest, sort, focus, and act. 3, prioritize the essential. We're going to talk about glass versus plastic balls. And 4, be kind to yourself. These steps build on learnings we shared earlier on how the mind actually works. For example, let's look at the first step, shall we?
Mm-hmm. We start with step 1, which is all about stemming the tide and coming to stillness. Remember, we were saying that our minds can be our worst enemies when we're feeling overwhelmed because we have a couple of these unconscious cognitive biases built into the way our minds make sense of the world, right? Catastrophizing, negative bias. The second is our tendency to spin stories to create chains of events. So imagine overwhelm is like facing a fire hydrant with a torrent of things coming at you, like a tennis ball launcher, Tetris game, going crazy, raining balls and breaks down at you just can't cope with. When we talk about stemming the tide, we're referring to this tide things coming at you. This makes you feel, excuse the pun, flooded. And none of us are really able to function at our best, are we, when we feel flooded? So this first step we need to take is to break this spiraling chain of thoughts and feelings, to give yourself some space in a moment. The space which Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, neurologist, psychologist, psychiatrist, and author, wrote about beautifully. Frankl said, quote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." I'll say that again because that's really important. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom.
Wow, that is one of the most powerful quotes I've ever heard.
It is, and we use it all the time with our trainings and in our coaching because in such a compact statement, there's a whole universe that can be unpacked. There's a whole practice right there. So how can we put this then into place? Well, when we're feeling flooded by our overwhelm, there are too many stimuli coming at us. Remember, losing control, both from the outside circumstances, deadlines, impinges on, tasks, this, that, people talking to us, getting interrupted. So there are many stimuli coming at us, both from the outside as well as our own inner turmoil and pressure. And we feel unable to respond at our best because the way we're trying to respond just can't keep up with the stimuli. Like that poor chap who's, lady is trying to bat back the balls and you just can't cope. The strategy is just not right. So the first step that we've got in our 4-step process here at LPI draws from Viktor Frankl's wisdom. Let's stem the tide and come to stillness, create that space and give ourselves the power to choose our response. That's what this first step is all about. So let's practice noticing. When we talk about choosing our response, let's practice noticing and widening this precious space between the initial stimulus, whether it's coming from the outside or coming from the inside, and how we respond to that stimulus. That is the entry point into stemming the tide of our overwhelm. The first step in gaining back some self-control and a vital piece of breathing room that can hack the circuit of overwhelm and help you step out of it.
Right, right. Now, let's look at how this step of stemming the tide and coming to stillness works in practice with a couple of examples. So let's say, for example, that you're trying to put some work plans into place, but COVID restrictions keep on changing without warning. Mm-hmm. You have staffing, suppliers, contractors to juggle around, and you need to update yourself with constantly changing regulations to your business.
I mean, especially right now with all the things that's going on, isn't there? I mean, in the world, we wrote this a couple of weeks ago, yeah, and it's just more relevant than ever, isn't it?
This constant turmoil. And, while all that is going on, it's further complicated by the fact that you have to coordinate your moving parts while working around your family's requirements, which are all also changing, right? COVID cases cropping up in school, you have new drop-off guidelines, children are maybe suffering, mentally and socially at home because of lockdown and all the uncertainty, or maybe you are looking after elderly parents who are feeling lonely and isolated. And while all that is going on, your partner's work is also in flux and very stressful at the same time.
Indeed. I'm sure there are many people listening to this like ourselves, who can empathize with a situation like that. I'll give you another example. How about a fairly standard snapshot of a family with young children in lockdown? We're all cooped up at home with not enough room for all of us really to be living on top of each other 24/7. It's a mess everywhere. We're running out of place to take our various calls. Children keep on interrupting or talking loudly in the background or arguing or just having fun, Parents trying to do our work in peace in different parts of the flat, but there never seems to be enough space to put out all your documents. The broadband connection keeps on sputtering. You lose your Zoom meeting, which has happened to me multiple times, so much so that, I had to install a new broadband, which seems to be working well so far, thank goodness. Maybe baby was crying, you didn't sleep well again last night. You're just generally super tired and fed up. Next week is your mom's birthday, and you have no idea what to do, etc., etc., etc.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I have to catch my breath for hearing about your typical day. But
some of that was hypothetical, but all of it was drawn from real life experience.
I'm sure so many people can relate exactly to it. Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? You want to do something to just stop the merry-go-round for a moment, but what can you do? So here's what you can do to start to take back control over your overwhelm. The first step is about stemming the tide, that coming to stillness, about giving yourself some space and some breathing room. And once you've stemmed the tide, you'll be better equipped to get to the heart of controlling your overwhelm. And here are some tips that we've come up with that work for us, and maybe they'll work for you as well.
Mm-hmm. The first thing to do is to notice that you are starting to feel overwhelmed in that moment. That's a first practical application of mindfulness to help. Notice that you're starting to feel overwhelmed in that moment. Catch yourself starting to go down the rabbit hole. For some of you, it may be a physical thing. Maybe your breath is shallow, your chest might be tightening. Maybe you notice your pulse starting to race. For some others, it may be first noticed in your thoughts. You may be finding your mind racing, starting to toggle rapidly between various demands, maybe starting to panic and feel like you're getting more than you can handle. For some others still, this may be manifested in your feelings. You may be aware of feeling stressed, feeling under pressure, feeling anxious, etc. So it could be physical, meaning your body, it could be your thoughts, it could be your feelings, or it could be a combination of the above. So everybody's different. When you start to practice, this noticing of when overwhelm starts to show up for you and how, the advantage of this is that you come to know yourself better and better. We are all creatures of habit, and the advantage of knowing yourself better is you can spot the early signals sooner and more easily next time. And that allows you to break the spell of your overwhelm sooner and more easily as you go along, because you would have known and spotted when you're about to go down the downward spiral again. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, once you notice it happening to yourself, that gives you the chance, as Viktor Frankl said, to step outside it and look at it from the outside. Remember the fish tank of the mind. You're not actually in the fish tank, being exposed and vulnerable to whatever threats come your way, helpless. No. When you remember that you are the base awareness outside the fish tank, watching what's going on in your mind, you then create what Viktor Frankl referred to as the space, the power to choose your response. You can choose not to let your whole consciousness fill up with your feelings of worry or stress or impotence. You simply observe that these feelings, these thoughts are there, present as one of the many elements in your consciousness right now. You can learn to accept their existence without resistance or judgment. But this is a whole different world from feeling like you are nothing but your worry, because then you really do feel trapped. Because, you're not actually trapped. All you need to do is to shift your perspective. When you're looking at the thoughts and feelings swirling around in the fish tank of your mind, you can choose not to identify with any of them. Identifying can sound like, I am just beside myself with anger right now. Like I have nothing but the anger in my mind. I am angry. I am angry. When I was going through my meditation teacher training, we were taught different language. We were taught, for example, to observe within ourselves, there is anger inside me, or there is anger, not even inside me, because we're taught to eventually let go of the whole idea of self, but there is anger. When you depersonify, when you choose not to identify with any of these thoughts or feelings, you're on your way to that freedom that Viktor Frankl talked about. You will realize, moreover, that you actually have a lot of space for lateral thinking, for considering other options, other perspectives, other ways of seeing your problems, and other solutions as well. These actually have existed all along. But because you haven't trained your attention and your attention is so problem focused, you don't even necessarily see that other options exist, that other freedoms exist, when your worldview is full of your feeling of overwhelm. So hopefully we get a sense now of why it's so important for us to teach you that training your attention is a superpower. And here in this second step, it allows you to step outside, that sense of overwhelm. So let's learn how to step outside it. It's as simple as taking a few minutes, even a few moments, to collect yourself and to breathe. Of course, there are many different forms of mindfulness. There's walking meditations, there is sitting meditation, there's supine meditation, but we wanted to teach you a basic one that focuses on just your breath. Even in the greatest crisis, for example, let's say a house is burning down, right? And for most of us, really, we're fortunate in that we're not facing such a critical and immediate emergency when we're facing our situations of overwhelm. They can feel really bad, but again, all things, being relative, if we say that even if your house really was burning down, even in the greatest crisis, there is still always space for a moment of stillness. And this little pocket of stillness you create for yourself can be incredibly powerful, because it allows us to stop running around like a headless chicken for a moment, stop being so knee-jerk or reactive to these numerous stimuli washing over us like a tide, and to start the process of reasserting control back over ourselves and therefore over our situations as well.
Right. Now, you mentioned breath. So let's now learn how to use your breath to create this pocket of stillness that we've been talking about. And you've no doubt heard the phrase, stop and take a deep breath, in the context of calming yourself down in a stressful situation or trying to calm someone else down in their situation. And I have no idea where that came from or when it came about, but persists because it works, evidently. Just as our thoughts and emotions can trigger a physical stress response in us, like tightness in the chest, rapid breathing, sweating, an addled mind, and elevated blood pressure, we can in turn use our bodies to trigger calm. And that is where we find this critical space to stem the tide. And intentional deep breathing is one of those calmness triggers. So let's try a controlled breathing exercise. Ready? I'd like you to take a long breath, inhaling and really filling up your lungs while you count to 4. And once you've done that, hold it just for a moment and give a really long exhaling breath until you count to 7 or 8 or as long as you can, okay? Let's try it. All right. How does that feel?
Feels so good. I haven't finished my out breath yet.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to cut your breath off there.
Wonderful.
It does. It's instantly calming.
It's so simple. I mean, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, it's something we could do every day. But every time we do this exercise, I just remind it all over again. Why don't I do this more often? Because it just feels great.
Yeah, and studies have shown if you do this 3 or 4 times in even a very stressful situation, it actually will calm your body and in turn calm your mind. So let's just, it felt so good. Let's try it again another 2 or 3 times and see what happens.
I mean,
does it make you sleepy?
No, I find it clarifies, you know, it clarifies and it stills and it centers and it grounds and all those beautiful things you talked about, like, you know, the stability and the equanimity. It's just amazing.
It's just a focus.
The body-mind connection is really, really extraordinary.
Yeah. And, you know, you might think that a simple trick like this doesn't really work. And, you know, I'm like that. I'm skeptical of quick fixes and things like that. But as I have, you can measure its effectiveness through biofeedback. So try taking your pulse rate immediately before and then right after the breathing exercise to see if there's a change. And better yet, if you have one of those, you know, portable automatic blood pressure cuffs that so many people have, go ahead and measure your blood pressure and pulse rate immediately before, then immediately after, you know, 2 or 3 cycles of this deep breathing exercise. I did it just to prove to myself that it worked, or to disprove that it works. I am a scientist after all. But I was really shocked about how much my blood pressure and pulse rate dropped. In fact, my blood pressure was the lowest it's been, you know, in 20 years after doing just this breathing exercise. So it does work.
Wow.
And yeah, crazy, right? But it does work. So tuning into your breath is one of the most classic meditation practices. And it's great, well, because everybody is breathing all the time, we hope. So it's a point of entry into this pocket of calmness that is constantly available to you. It doesn't need anything extra. You can be in the middle of whatever. You don't have to go anywhere. It's completely private. You don't have to roll out your yoga mat, put on your tights or anything like that. You could do it in the middle of a Zoom meeting or recording a podcast. I've taken a few deep breaths during this podcast. And if you didn't notice, that's great, because it just shows that nobody will be the wiser. And it's such a simple, accessible, and powerful way for anyone to start to regain a sense of control and perspective anytime, anywhere.
Thanks for mentioning that, Paul, because regaining your sense of control actually comes through gaining a much more spacious, expansive perspective of your situation. One of my favorite things I've ever learned from my Buddhist meditation teacher, Dr. Alan Wallace, is when he compared our minds to a teacup versus an ocean. When a mind is not exercised by regular training through contemplative practice like meditation or yoga or some forms of martial arts, for example, our minds tend to shrink to the size of the problems occupying it. Meaning, when an unexercised mind experiencing stress or overwhelm, our minds become, you know, they get filled up to the size of the stress or overwhelm, so that we can really struggle to see past the overwhelm and to realize that actually we have quite a bit more freedom to choose multiple options that are available to us than we realize. One of the most powerful meditation trainings we were taught to practice was to exercise the spaciousness of our consciousness. Dr. Wallace illustrated the power of this tactic by inviting us to consider our minds as if they were a teacup. Now, if our minds were a teacup filled with water, and if a drop of water were to fall into that teacup, that would cause significant disturbance to the liquid in the teacup. The surface would ripple significantly, for example, because the teacup's so small. A drop of water is a relatively large disruption. But what if our minds were the size of an ocean? I mean, just imagine that for a minute. Teacup, your mind versus ocean, or even a mountain lake. What would happen if the same drop of water fell into that? You know the answer. Practically nothing. It wouldn't even be noticed. It would just be instantaneously absorbed by that wide, spacious, deep body of water. Here's the thing. Is the drop of water smaller when it fell into the teacup compared to the ocean, or bigger? No. They're the same size. Similarly, our troubles and our challenges are not necessarily shrinking when we practice broadening and deepening our sense of self. That's an important point to make, because we're not advocating here, oh, let's make our troubles smaller, let's cut them down to size, when we talk about putting things into perspective. You know how that works sometimes, and it doesn't always work. It sounds like this. Maybe you're really distressed about something, maybe not being able to spend a holiday season with your folks. Maybe you're worried about your health or financial situation, or maybe someone close to you, and you're confiding to a friend, right? I mean, about your worries and about feeling a bit overwhelmed by everything that's going on, and no end, really clearly inside. And sometimes what happens is, in their bid to tell you that that's okay, sometimes people can end up attempting to minimize your troubles, whether consciously or unconsciously. It sounds like this: oh, it's not that bad. It's going to be fine. Don't worry. Don't think so much about it. It'll all work itself out. And you're like, it's not. Instead of feeling helped, and this has happened to me multiple times, right? Instead of feeling helped and supported, you may end up feeling worse. Like the person just doesn't fully get why this is so overwhelming to you. And that becomes even more isolating. So it's important to notice that we're not advocating that here. We're not advocating minimizing your troubles or being sort of just stoic about it and just not letting it get to you. I mean, that's one way of coping with it. That's not the way we're referring to here. What we're advocating here is different, but it's so powerful. We're reminding you that you do have a choice to step outside your current perspective and to direct you in your breath practice to step outside the fish tank of your mind and its worries, and to consciously practice thinking of feeling your awareness, not as a teacup, but as this wide, spacious ocean. Because your mind really is that big. It's just that we're not used to feeling it that size. But just because we're not used to feeling it that size doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in its potency and that size. We just have to train ourselves to expand that sense of consciousness in our, in our awareness. We have a mountain lake meditation that helps with that in another video, which we'll put a link to in the comments section below if you're keen to give that a try. For now, just remember that don't let your worried, overwhelmed mind shrink to the size of a teacup, where your challenges can appear like they're everything in your life and you have no hope of getting out. Notice your overwhelm, step outside and start to watch your fish tank from the outside. Tune into your breath, like Paul showed us so beautifully, to create this pocket of stillness where you can start to realize you have more choices and agency than you might have thought, not seeing it before in your previous overwhelmed state. And finally, add perspective. Think of your mind as a wide, calm, spacious ocean with plenty of room to move, rather than shrunken into a small, tunnel vision state of overwhelm and panic.
Wow. I mean, every time I hear that, I'm just so struck. It seems like such a simple concept at face value, but it's revolutionary, I think, for
We're
a lot
not
of
taught
people
that,
being able
Paul, are
to,
we? Yeah.
expand your consciousness like that. It really is. And I always imagine now the mountain lake visualization. If I'm really gnawing at something, or something's really gnawing at me, I see the ripples and in the midst of this large mountain, peaceful mountain lake, and I feel a little bit better about it. So yeah. So now that we've taken the first pivotal step towards arresting your sense of overwhelm by stemming the tide and coming into stillness, we'll close the first part of our podcast, LPI Takes On Overwhelm. And in this episode, just to refresh, we talked about a number of things. We talked about what overwhelm is. It's a sense of losing control over a tide of external tasks and internal thoughts and feelings coming at you like a tennis ball launcher or a Tetris game. We talked about some of the major sources of overwhelm facing people right now. Many of you can relate to some of these things. And of course, those include COVID, the job situation, your finances, childcare, issues revolving around lockdown, isolation and loneliness that we feel now, particularly during the holiday season, health worries that we might have, the political situation in the world, and so on. But we also want to leave you with the encouraging news that you do have more control over your overwhelm than you think.
Mm-hmm. We also talked about gaining more control over your own state and your circumstances, and how that starts from understanding the nature of your mind better, learning how it can sabotage you through unconscious cognitive biases like negativity bias and catastrophizing, and storytelling, creating a chain of events in your mind, and starting to learn how to unhook yourself from these unhelpful habits. We talked about how the mind is like an inner theater or fish tank, where ephemeral thoughts, feelings, impulses, and moods and other inner phenomena naturally come and go. And you can step out of this fish tank and observe your inner phenomena safely, rather than being in the fish tank amongst that chaos and drama. Finally, we talked also about the entry point to hacking your overwhelm circuit, and how that starts with step 1, stemming the tide and coming into stillness, through breath work and gaining perspective, the mind not as a teacup, but as an ocean.
Wonderful. And this brings us to the close of this first segment of LPI Takes On Overwhelm. We hope you found it helpful and illuminating, and if you learned a few things about your own mind and how to better cope with overwhelm, and which can start to make a real difference in your everyday life.
Mm-hmm. In our next upcoming segment on LPI Takes On Overwhelm, we'll walk you through the remaining steps 2 to 4, where we'll teach you how to focus, prioritize, and act, keep the essential and ditch the non-essential, and finally, be kind to yourself. Please subscribe to our new YouTube channel to be alerted to our latest releases. We'd love to hear your thoughts. In the comments box below, please share the video if you think it would be helpful to somebody in your circle. Follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook at Living Potential International. And we'll also be launching a blog in the new year, so stay tuned. Till then, we're signing out for now. Elaine and Paul wishing you happy holidays, stay safe and healthy, and take care, and all the best for the new year. Bye for now.